$400 for that bag of bones? You're more desperate than I thought, Clara. Van Sterling's laughter sliced through the humid stench of the Street George livestock auction. He leaned against the rusted iron fencing, flicking cigar ash near her mud-caked boots. That thing won't survive the trailer ride to Beaufort, let alone save your daddy's farm. Clara Whitmore tightened her grip on the frayed lead rope, her jaw set hard as she glared up at the wealthy developer. It's got 4 legs and a heartbeat, Vance. That's more soul than you'll ever have. The Street George livestock auction was a graveyard of broken promises and failed dreams, smelling violently of diesel exhaust, frightened animal sweat, and stale beer. It was the end of the line for the unwanted, the crippled, and the simply unlucky. Clara Whitmore stood in the center of the sawdust-covered ring, the oppressive South Carolina heat pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Her faded denim jeans were stained with grease from her ailing truck, and the brim of her father's old Stetson cast a dark shadow over her exhausted, hollowed eyes. She had precisely $412 in her checking account. It was the last of the farm's operating budget, the final drops of lifeblood for a property that had been in her family for 4 generations. In the center of the ring stood a horse that looked as though it had been assembled from leftover parts. It was a grulla, a mousy, slate-gray color with a dark dorsal stripe running down its back and zebra-like striping on its legs. But it was painfully thin. Its ribs showed like the slats of a broken Venetian blind. Its chest was narrow. Its neck was a thin, U-necked curve, and its head seemed slightly too large for its body. Its coat was matted with burrs and dried mud, its mane a tangled, coarse nightmare. Yet beneath the grime and the neglect, the animal stood perfectly still, its dark, intelligent eyes taking in the chaotic surroundings with a calm, unnerving stoicism. It didn't pace. It didn't whinny in terror. It simply watched. "All right, boys. What we got for this grade gelding? Meat price. Let's start at 300. The auctioneer's voice droned over the distorted loudspeakers. Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. The kill buyers, men who packed horses into trailers bound for slaughterhouses across the border, were already leaning forward, their checkbooks ready. She hadn't come here to buy a horse. She had come to sell her late father's antique silver-mounted parade saddle, hoping to buy herself another month on the mortgage. But looking at the strange, scrawny animal, something deep within her chest seized. It was the way the horse held its head, not with defeat, but with a quiet, enduring defiance. 300. A heavy-set man in a soiled trucker hat shouted, waving a numbered paddle. 350, Clara heard herself say. Her voice was raspy, dry as dust, but it cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Vance Sterling, standing in the VIP gallery above, let out a derisive snort. Vance was the man holding the banknote on her farm, a ruthless developer who drove a pristine black Range Rover and wore imported Italian leather boots that had never touched actual horse manure. He had been circling Clara's waterfront property in Beaufort like a vulture for 6 months, eager to bulldoze her ancestral home and turn the coastal acreage into a gated luxury golf resort. 400. The kill buyer grunted, glaring at Clara. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. She thought of the overdue electric bill. She thought of the empty grain bins at home. Then she looked at the grulla horse. It turned its large, flat-profiled head toward her, its ears swiveling. 400, Clara yelled, stepping forward, slapping her hand against the railing. And not a penny more. The auctioneer paused, scanning the crowd. The kill buyer spat a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust and turned away. The horse was too scrawny to be worth a bidding war. Sold. $400 to the little lady in the front. As Clara led the horse toward her rusted 2-horse trailer, the animal moved with a strange, gliding stride. It didn't trot with the bouncy, suspended movement of a quarter horse or a thoroughbred. It seemed to slide over the gravel, its feet moving in a rapid, 4-beat rhythm that kept its back perfectly level. Vance Sterling intercepted her at the loading ramp. He smelled of expensive cologne and predatory confidence. "You're a fool, Clara," he sneered. eyeing the bony creature. "You just spent your last dime on a walking corpse. I'll give you 30 days to clear your junk off the property. The bank transfers the deed to my LLC on the 1st of next month. We'll see about that, Vance," Clara muttered, clicking her tongue. The little horse stepped up into the dark, rattling trailer without a moment of hesitation. It was the only easy thing that had happened to Clara in months. She slammed the heavy metal door shut, locked the latch, and climbed into the driver's seat of her beat-up Ford. As she merged onto Highway 17, heading south toward the deep marshes of Beaufort, she glanced in the rearview mirror. She had no money, a foreclosure looming, and a half-starved, strange-looking horse. But as she watched the steady, unfazed expression of the Grulla in the mirror, she realized she finally had something she had been missing for a very long time. A partner. Windswept Oaks was a beautiful ghost of a farm. Ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss lined the long dirt driveway, their roots thick and gnarled, gripping the sandy soil. The barn's roof sagged, and the white paint on the fences had long since peeled away, revealing gray, weathered wood underneath. Beyond the pastures lay the sprawling, endless expanse of the South Carolina salt marshes, miles of tall spartina grass, tidal creeks, and the thick, black, sulfur-smelling sludge known as pluff mud. The morning after the auction, Clara woke before dawn. She brewed a pot of bitter, cheap coffee and walked down to the paddock. The Grulla gelding, whom she had unceremoniously dubbed Bones, was standing near the fence line. Instead of grazing on the sparse Bermuda grass in the center of the paddock, Bones had his head shoved through the wooden rails, eagerly tearing at the coarse, salty cordgrass that grew at the marsh's edge. "You're a weird one, aren't you?" Clara murmured, slipping a faded nylon halter over his large head. He took the halter willingly, his eyes soft and incredibly ancient. She decided to saddle him. Digging out her father's old cracked leather McClellan cavalry saddle and a simple D-ring snaffle bit, Bones stood like a statue as she tightened the girth. When she swung up into the saddle, she braced herself for a buck, a rear, or a nervous bolt. Instead, Bones simply let out a long sigh and waited for her cue. Clara nudged him forward toward the tidal flats. As they hit the soft, sandy edge of the water, she asked him for a trot. But Bones didn't trot. He shifted gears into a miraculously smooth, rolling gait. It felt as though she were sitting in a rocking chair gliding on ice. She could have carried a brimming cup of hot coffee without spilling a single drop. "What in the world?" Clara whispered, looking down at his legs. They were moving in a blur, a specialized single-foot gait that covered ground with astonishing speed, but required almost zero vertical effort. "I see you found yourself a ghost, Miss Clara." Clara pulled Bones to a halt. Standing near the edge of the creek was Elias, an elderly Gullah Geechee man who had lived on the neighboring property his entire life. He wore faded overalls and leaned heavily on a hand-carved sweet gum walking stick. Elias knew the swamp better than any mapmaker. He knew the tides, the gators, and the deep hidden histories of the low country. "A ghost, Elias?" "I found him at the Street George kill pen," Clara said, leaning forward to pat the horse's sweaty neck. "He's a mutt, skinny, strange-gaited, and eats marsh grass like its sweet feed." Elias chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to echo from the mud itself. He hobbled closer, reaching out a gnarled hand to stroke the horse's flat forehead. Bones leaned into the touch affectionately. "He ain't no mutt, child, and he ain't no normal horse," Elias said, his eyes reverent. "You don't know what you got between your knees, that there is a Carolina Marsh Tacky." Clara frowned. "A Marsh Tacky? I thought those went extinct decades ago." "Almost did," Elias nodded, pointing to the horse's zebra-striped legs and the dark line down his back. "See these markings? This blood is older than the United States. Left here by the Spanish explorers in the 1500s, they survived on the sea islands, wild and free. They ate the salt grass, drank the brackish water, and learned to walk atop the pluff mud without sinking. When the Revolutionary War came, General Francis Marion, the swamp fox himself, rode these little horses. The British had their giant, heavy warm bloods. The British sank in the swamp. The swamp fox and his men, they vanished into the mist on their tackies. This horse right here, he's pure low-country royalty. Clara stared down at the scrawny, funny-looking gelding. Suddenly, his narrow chest and flat ribs didn't look like signs of poor breeding. They looked like the aerodynamic evolution of an animal designed to slip through dense palmetto thickets. His strange gait was an adaptation to cover miles of treacherous marsh without exhausting himself. To test Elias's theory, Clara turned Bones toward a deep patch of exposed pluff mud, the kind of treacherous, suctioning sludge that would trap a normal quarter horse up to its belly and snap its legs in a panic. "Easy, boy," she cautioned. Bones didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the mud. His hooves seemed to splay slightly, and instead of plunging downward, he scrambled across the top of the sludge with the frantic, light-footed agility of a shorebird. He didn't panic. He didn't sink. He danced across the death trap and stepped onto solid ground as if it were nothing but a paved road. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She patted his neck, her hands trembling. She hadn't bought a bag of bones. She had bought a $400 miracle. And as she looked out over the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Beaufort marshes, a desperate, dangerous idea began to form in her mind. The tires of Vance Sterling's pristine black Range Rover crunched loudly over the oyster-shell driveway of windswept oaks. Clara was in the barn, vigorously brushing the dried mud from Bones's coat, watching as the rich, grulla color began to shine under her grooming. Bones had put on 40 pounds in 2 weeks. Thriving on the Spartina grass and a meager ration of sweet feed, Vance stepped out of his vehicle, meticulously adjusting the cuffs of his expensive linen shirt. He looked around the decaying property with an expression of open disgust, as if the poverty might somehow jump onto his clothing. "Moving day is approaching, Clara," Vance announced, striding into the dim, dusty aisle of the barn. "I've got the surveyors coming next Tuesday. I thought I'd do you a favor and offer you a few thousand for your relocation. You know, to soften the blow. You can take that ugly nag to the glue factory where it belongs." Clara dropped her dandy brush into her grooming tote. She stepped out of the stall, closing the heavy wooden door behind her. "I'm not leaving, Vance. The bank gave me until the end of the month. And you think you're going to magically conjure $80,000 by the 31st? Vance laughed. A sharp, cruel sound. "Face reality. Your father ran this place into the ground. He was a sentimental old fool. And you're just like him." Clara's fists clenched so hard her knuckles turned white. "Don't you talk about my father. I'll talk about whatever I want on my property." Vance sneered, stepping into her personal space. "I own the debt. I own the paper. I own you." Clara looked past Vance's shoulder, her eyes fixing on a flyer tacked to the barn's bulletin board. It was an advertisement for the upcoming Palmetto State Endurance Classic. It was a notoriously brutal, grueling 50-mile race that cut directly through the heart of the Ashpoo, Combahee, and Edisto Ace Basin. It traversed treacherous swamps, thick pine forests, and miles of humid, unforgiving wilderness. The purse for first place was exactly $100,000, sponsored by a consortium of wealthy equestrians, of which Vance Sterling was a prominent board member. "Are you riding Titan in the Classic this year?" Clara asked, her voice dangerously calm. Titan was Vance's pride and joy, a massive $50,000 Arabian quarter-horse cross that had won the race 2 years in a row. Vance looked momentarily confused by the change of subject. "Of course. It's practically a victory lap for me. The prize money will pay for the clubhouse foundations right here on your land." "I'll make you a wager," Clara said, stepping forward, her eyes blazing with a sudden, reckless fire. "I'm entering the race. If I beat you, if I cross that finish line before you and Titan, do you tear up the mortgage note? You clear the debt, and Windswept Oaks is mine." Free and clear, Vance stared at her, then erupted into genuine, roaring laughter. He laughed so hard, he had to wipe a tear from his eye. "You? On what? That $400 bag of bones? Clara, 50 miles in the Ace Basin will kill that animal. The humidity alone will drop him in the first 20 miles. That's my problem, Clara said, her voice like steel. What's the matter, Vance? Are you afraid a kill-pen rescue might show up, your $50,000 champion? Vance's laughter abruptly ceased. His eyes narrowed, his ego pricked by the challenge. He hated being questioned, and he despised losing face. You're suicidal, but I'm a gambling man. What do I get when you lose? If I lose, Clara said, her heart hammering violently in her chest. I won't wait until the 31st. I'll sign the deed over to you at the finish line, and I will walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. No relocation fee, no legal fights. I'll vanish. Vance's lips curled into a predatory smile. It was the perfect deal for him. He wouldn't have to deal with the messy foreclosure process or Clara's stubborn legal appeals. He could break her spirit and take her land in one fell swoop. I'll have my lawyers draft the contract tonight, Vance said smoothly. He glanced into the stall at Bones, who was calmly chewing a mouthful of hay, completely indifferent to the millionaire. I hope you have a shovel, Clara, because you're going to be burying that horse in the swamp. As Vance drove away, Clara leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the stall door. She was terrified. She was betting the only thing she had left in the world on a horse she had known for less than a month. But when Bones shoved his velvety muzzle over the door and nudged her shoulder, she felt a surge of ancient, undeniable strength. The Marsh Tacky was bred for the swamp. It was time to show the world what that meant. The morning of the Palmetto State Endurance Classic dawned with the oppressive, suffocating humidity typical of the South Carolina low country. The air felt like hot soup, thick with the smell of decaying vegetation and salt. Spanish moss hung motionless from the massive live oak trees, serving as the starting line at the edge of the Ace Basin. Over 50 riders were gathered, a sea of elite athletes and expensive horseflesh. Sleek Arabians, heavily muscled quarter horses, and tall, elegant warmbloods danced nervously in the misty dawn. The riders wore high-tech, moisture-wicking synthetic gear, specialized endurance saddles, and GPS heart rate monitors. Then there was Clara. She sat quietly astride Bones, wearing her father's faded denim, battered leather boots, and the antique McClellan saddle. Bones looked ridiculously small and unimpressive among the giants. He stood completely still, his head lowered, conserving every ounce of his energy. His heart rate was a slow, steady drumbeat. Vance Sterling rode past on Titan. The massive, golden chestnut horse was already sweating, prancing sideways, expending vital energy before the race had even begun. Vance wore a custom-tailored riding suit, smirking as he looked down at Clara. "Try not to die out there, Clara," Vance called out, his voice carrying over the nervous snorts of the horses. "I brought a pen for you to sign the deed at the finish line." Clara didn't answer. She just rubbed Bones's withers. The starter raised the flare gun. Crack! The massive horses surged forward. The first 10 miles were along a wide, packed dirt logging road. The Arabians and warmbloods shot ahead, eating up the ground with massive, ground-covering strides. Vance and Titan were quickly at the front of the pack. Clara held Bones back. She let him find his rhythm, that bizarre, incredibly smooth, single-foot gait. It didn't look fast, but as the miles ticked by, Clara realized they were maintaining a relentless, steady speed of about 12 miles an hour, without Bones breaking a sweat. By mile 20, the sun was high, and the temperature soared to a sweltering 98 degrees. The heat index was well over 110. The logging road ended, and the trail plunged directly into the heart of the swamp. This was where the race truly began. The terrain turned vicious. The ground was slick with black mud, tangled with exposed cypress knees that acted like natural tripwires, and choked with dense palmetto fronds that slapped at the riders' legs. Clara watched as the leaders began to falter. A beautiful gray Arabian stumbled over a root, its rider pulling up. Another horse was breathing with heavy, rasping gasps, overheated and refusing to move forward. The heavy muscles of the quarter horses, perfect for short sprints, were working against them in the suffocating heat. trapping the thermal energy in their bodies. Bones, however, was in his element. The Marsh Tacky's flat ribs and narrow chest allowed the air to circulate perfectly around his lungs, dissipating the heat. He didn't fight the treacherous ground. He flowed over it. He picked his way through the cypress knees with the precision of a mountain goat, his small, tough hooves finding purchase where the larger horses slipped and scrambled. By mile 35, Clara had passed over half the field. Bones was breathing steadily, his coat barely damp. He took a few gulps of brackish water from a swamp puddle water the pampered show horses refused to touch and kept moving. Ahead, she saw the golden coat of Titan. Vance's horse was lathered in thick, white foam. Titan's head was bobbing heavily, his eyes wide with exhaustion and panic. Vance was viciously spurring the horse, forcing him through a section of deep, fetid black water. Clara caught up to them at mile 40. The trail narrowed dangerously, running along a thin levee between a deep, stagnant slough and an expansive field of exposed, treacherous pluff mud. The tide was going out, leaving the deceptive mudflats glistening under the brutal sun. "Vance, you're pushing him too hard," Clara shouted over the sucking sound of the mud. "He's going to tie up." Vance whipped his head around, his face flushed red with heat and fury. He couldn't believe Clara and that pathetic rescue horse were right behind him. His pride, inflated and fragile, shattered into rage. "Shut up, you white trash beggar," Vance roared, cracking his crop against Titan's hindquarters. "I am not losing to you." In a desperate, reckless maneuver to block Clara from passing on the narrow levee, Vance yanked hard on Titan's left rein. He intended to force Clara down into the brush, but Titan, exhausted and terrified, lost his footing on the slick edge. The massive horse scrambled, panicked, and plunged sideways off the levee, directly into the open expanse of the pluff mud. The moment Titan's heavy hooves hit the mud, the trap snapped shut. Pluff mud is not like regular mud. It is a deceptive, gelatinous mix of decaying marsh grass and silt that acts exactly like quicksand. Titan, weighing over 1,200 pounds, instantly sank to his knees. Terrified, the massive horse thrashed violently, trying to lunge forward. Every desperate plunge only buried him deeper. Within seconds, the horse was sunk to his belly, screaming in a high-pitched, equine terror that chilled Clara's blood. In the chaos, Vance was thrown violently from the saddle. He flew through the air and landed face-first 15 feet away in the deepest part of the mud flat. Clara brought Bones to an immediate, sliding halt on the safe edge of the levee. Bones planted his feet, his ears pricked forward, entirely unbothered by the screaming horse. He had seen the mud before. His ancestors had survived it. Vance pushed himself up, coughing up foul, black sludge. His custom riding suit was ruined, his face smeared with the putrid stench of sulfur and rot. He tried to take a step toward the levee, but his Italian boots were instantly sucked off his feet. He sank to his thighs. "Help me," Vance screamed, the arrogance completely stripped from his voice, replaced by raw, primal panic. "Clara, I'm sinking." Clara sat on Bones, staring down at the man who had tormented her, the man who had plotted to steal her family's legacy and pave over her father's grave for a golf course. A dark, vengeful thought crossed her mind. She could ride away. She could leave him here. By the time the rescue buggies arrived, he would be buried to his neck, entirely at the mercy of the swamp. A heavy splash in the slough to their right broke her concentration. A massive American alligator, easily 12 feet long, slid off a muddy bank and into the dark water, its cold reptilian eyes fixing on the thrashing Titan and the screaming Vance. The vibration of their panic was ringing the dinner bell. Vance saw the gator. He began to hyperventilate, clawing uselessly at the mud, only sinking deeper. "Please, Clara, for God's sake, help me." Karma had arrived, swift and brutal. But Clara was not Vance Sterling. She was a Whitmore. "Hold still, you idiot, or you'll drag yourself under." Clara snapped, unwrapping the long, braided rawhide lariat. Her father had always kept tied to the McClellan saddle. She nudged Bones. The Marsh Tacky stepped off the solid levee and onto the pluff mud. Clara held her breath. But just as he had done at the tidal creek, Bones's hooves splayed. He lowered his head, shifted his center of gravity, and engaged his unique, gliding walk. He moved across the top of the sludge like a water strider, sinking barely an inch. Clara maneuvered Bones until she was within throwing distance of Vance. She twirled the lariat and let it fly. The loop landed perfectly over Vance's shoulders. "Grab the rope and don't let go," Clara yelled. She dallied the rope around the saddle horn. Bones didn't need to be told what to do. The little $400 horse lowered his hindquarters, dug his specialized hooves into the slick surface, and threw his weight against the rope. The muscles beneath his scrawny-looking coat corded with astonishing, compact power. With a sickening schluck, Vance was pulled violently from the suction of the mud. Bones dragged the millionaire on his stomach across 20 feet of jagged oyster shells, foul sludge, and marsh grass, hauling him unceremoniously back onto the solid dirt of the levee. Vance lay there, covered head to toe in black, foul-smelling muck, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara quickly rode over to Titan. Using the lariat, she managed to loop it around the horse's neck. Speaking calmly, she guided Bones to pull at an angle, helping the exhausted, terrified giant find a shelf of solid roots beneath the mud. With a monumental heave, Titan scrambled up onto the bank, trembling and coated in mud, but alive. Clara coiled her rope and tied it back to the saddle. She looked down at Vance, who was curled in a pathetic, whimpering ball. "Race isn't over, Vance," Clara said coldly. "But you are." She clucked her tongue. Bones stepped smoothly forward, leaving the broken millionaire in the dirt, and continued down the trail toward the finish line. The finish line of the Palmetto State Endurance Classic was set up on the manicured lawns of an old antebellum plantation. Dozens of wealthy spectators, journalists, and investors milled around white tents, sipping mint juleps and checking their watches. They were expecting Vance Sterling's golden champion to emerge from the tree line at any moment. Instead, a small, dusty, mouse-gray horse trotted out from the shadows of the live oaks. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. The announcer checked his clipboard, squinting through his binoculars. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have our first finisher. It appears to be rider number 42, Clara Whitmore, riding an unregistered grade gelding." Clara rode through the finish line flags, pulling Bones to a gentle halt. The little horse let out a long breath, shook his head, and immediately dropped his nose to munch on the manicured Bermuda grass. He wasn't panting. He wasn't shaking. He looked as though he had just returned from a brisk morning stroll. The veterinarians rushed forward to check his vitals, their eyes widening in shock when they found his heart rate was perfectly normal and his temperature was safe. 20 minutes later, the swamp rescue buggy arrived, towing a humiliated, mud-soaked Vance Sterling and a limping, exhausted Titan. The contrast was staggering. The media immediately descended. Cameras flashed, capturing Vance's absolute degradation. The wealthy investors who had backed his luxury resort project, men who valued image and competence above all else, watched in horror as Vance threw a temper tantrum, screaming at the medics and blaming his horse for his own catastrophic failure. Clara stood by Bones, holding the massive, oversized silver cup and a check for $100,000. But the true victory came an hour later, when Vance, legally bound by the contract witnessed by the race officials, was forced to sign the release of the deed to Windswept Oaks. His hands shook with fury and humiliation as he scrawled his name, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. His investors pulled their funding the very next morning, citing his unstable behavior and public disgrace. The golf resort was dead. As Clara loaded Bones into the rusty trailer, an older man in a tailored blazer approached her. He introduced himself as the president of the Carolina Marsh Tacky Association. He had recognized the horse's unique gait and primitive markings during the race. "Miss Whitmore," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have been searching for a stallion of his lineage for a decade. He is a premier specimen of a critically endangered breed. If you are willing, we would like to set him up as a foundation sire. You could name your price for his stud fee." Clara looked at the scrawny, brilliant little horse who had saved her life, saved her farm, and brought down a tyrant. She smiled, patting his flat, noble forehead. "His name is Bones," Clara said softly, "and he's not for sale, but we'd be honored to help save the breed." Karma had come to the Low Country, riding on the back of a $400 miracle, proving that true value isn't measured in pedigree or price tags, but in heart, heritage, and the unbroken spirit of the swamp. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the South Carolina Low Country. Clara leaned against the weathered fence of windswept oaks, watching the little dun horse graze peacefully on the coarse salt grass. He wasn't a show horse, nor was he born to a pedigree of modern champions, but he possessed something far more profound: the unbroken spirit of the marsh. He was a survivor, a living testament to a forgotten history, and the absolute savior of her family's legacy. As the crickets began their evening symphony and the tide rolled in, carrying the scent of pluff, mud, and pine, Clara finally knew peace. The swamp had spoken, and Karma had answered. If you felt your heart pound alongside Clara and her incredible Marsh Tacky, please hit that like button. Share this story with fellow horse lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, soulful Western tales.